A woman stands in a cave beneath the mountains of Eastern Europe, touching something that has been growing in the darkness for thousands of years. The moment her hand makes contact with the fungal mass, her mind floods with the memories of everyone who has ever died in these mountains. Hundreds of lives, thousands of consciousnesses, all preserved inside a biological network that predates human civilization. This single moment in 1919 would eventually lead to Raccoon City burning. It would create Umbrella Corporation. It would spawn Eveline, the Bakers, and every bioweapon experiment the Resident Evil universe has documented for over 2 decades. One grieving mother touching an ancient fungus becomes the origin point for institutional horror that spans continents and generations. This video examines the hidden systems, overlooked details, and uncomfortable truths embedded in Resident Evil Village. By the end, you will understand how corporate ambition, grief weaponized into science, and biological mechanisms we barely comprehend created a world where the line between victim and monster dissolves completely. This analysis explores thematic depth and psychological implications within the source material rather than simply recapping events. If you enjoy these kind of deep dives, drop a comment letting me know and help get this video spread through the algorithm. You can also throw out a topic suggestion for a future video while you are there. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us start. Chapter 1: The Biological Archive. Before Miranda. Before Spencer. Before the concept of bioweapons existed in anyone's mind, something was growing beneath the mountains. The Megamycete is not a virus. Calling it mold barely scratches the surface of what this organism actually does. This is a fungal supercolony that has existed for millennia, possibly tens of thousands of years, consuming organic matter and preserving something that should not be preservable: consciousness itself. Fungus operate on principles that separate them from every other kingdom of life. They do not simply consume, they integrate. A fungal network spreads through soil, connecting trees across entire forests, allowing chemical communication between organisms that have no nervous system. The Megamycete takes this principle to an extreme that violates everything we understand about how memory and identity function. When an organism dies within reach of the Megamycete's underground network, the fungus consumes the body. That part is normal decomposition. What happens next is not. During decomposition, the Megamycete performs something called horizontal gene transfer. It copies the complete genetic blueprint of the organism at a cellular level. Every strand of DNA, every protein structure, the entire biological recipe that made that organism what it was. But it does not stop at genetics. The fungus somehow preserves neural patterns, memories, emotional imprints, the electrical configurations that made a mind function. All of it gets stored in the mycelial network like code on a biological hard drive. This is not metaphor. Documents recovered from Miranda's lab confirm that people who make physical contact with the Megamycete experience a phenomenon she described as consciousness flooding. They instantly perceive memories from hundreds or thousands of individuals the fungus has consumed over centuries. Not vague impressions, complete experiences. You see what they saw, feel what they felt, know what they knew. The implications are staggering. This means death, at least in the traditional sense, does not necessarily end consciousness if the Megamycete reaches you. Your body decomposes, your cells break down, but some fragment of what made you aware, what made you you, continues existing inside a fungal network that has no brain, no neurons, no structure that should be capable of storing thought. And it has been doing this since before recorded history. Archaeological evidence found in the region shows that human populations interacted with the Megamycete for generations without understanding what they were dealing with. There are signs of increased mold activity in the 15th century. Infected individuals were documented as monsters by ancient communities who had no framework for understanding biological mutation. They thought they were fighting demons. They were fighting people whose cells had been replaced by fungal imitations. The cave where the Megamycete's central mass exists sits at the heart of a network that extends through the mountain range. Smaller deposits of mold spread through underground systems, reaching different elevations, different valleys, different burial sites. Every corpse the network reached added to the archive. Peasants, nobility, soldiers who died in conflicts no history book remembers. Children who never lived long enough to have their lives recorded anywhere except in the memory of fungus. By the time Miranda stumbled into that cave in 1919, the Megamycete had been archiving human consciousness for longer than Christianity had existed in Europe. It was a library of the dead, and it was still growing. Miranda described the moment of contact in her personal journals. The entries read like someone trying to process an experience human language was never designed to express. She writes about seeing the world through eyes that were not hers, feeling emotions attached to faces she did not recognize, experiencing deaths she did not die, hundreds of lives flooding into her mind simultaneously. And among all those archived consciousnesses, she found her daughter. Eva had been buried in the Potter's Field, the overflow cemetery used when the main graveyard filled to capacity during the Spanish flu pandemic. The burial site was close enough to the cave system that the Megamycete's underground network had reached her small corpse. It consumed her body, and in the process of breaking down that 10-year-old girl's cells, the fungus had preserved some fragment of what made Eva aware. Miranda's scientific background let her understand what most people would interpret as religious experience. This was not her daughter's soul ascending to heaven. This was biological information storage. The mold had created a copy of Eva's neural patterns, her memories, her sense of self, all stored in fungal tissue that would theoretically persist as long as the colony survived, which meant Eva could, in theory, be brought back. Not resurrected in any supernatural sense, reconstructed. If Miranda could find a host body compatible enough, if she could transfer that archived consciousness into living tissue, if she could get the biology right, her daughter could exist again. Not as a ghost, as a person, breathing, thinking, aware. This became Miranda's singular focus, and it required understanding how the Megamycete actually functions at a molecular level. The mold achieves what it does through a mechanism that sounds like science fiction, but is grounded in real biological processes taken to impossible extremes. When mold spores infect a host, they do not attack the cells. They replace them. Human cells die and regenerate constantly. Your body replaces its entire skin surface every few weeks. Your stomach lining renews every few days. Cells divide, copy their genetic information, die, and get replaced by new cells carrying the same DNA blueprint. It is a process happening in your body right now, every second you have been alive. The mold hijacks this process. Infected cells do not simply get sick, they get copied. The fungal tissue studies the cell's structure, its function, its genetic code, and creates a fungal imitation that performs the exact same role. The imitation looks like the original cell, acts like the original cell. To the immune system, to other cells, to any biological test, the fungal copy is indistinguishable from authentic human tissue. Except, it is not human tissue. It is fungus wearing the cell's blueprint. This replacement happens gradually, one cell at a time, one tissue type at a time. Eventually, given enough time, every cell in an infected organism can be replaced with a mold imitation. The organism still looks the same, moves the same, thinks the same, but biologically they have become a mobile colony of fungus shaped like a person. This is exactly what happened to Ethan Winters in Resident Evil 7, though he would not learn this truth until Village. When Jack Baker killed him in the guest house, Ethan died. Clinical death. No heartbeat, no brain activity. Dead. But the Baker estate was saturated with mold from Eveline's presence. The fungus reached Ethan's corpse within minutes of death. And rather than simply decomposing the body, the mold did what it has been doing for thousands of years. It copied him. Every cell, every tissue, every neural pathway. The fungus created a perfect imitation of Ethan Winters that stood up, regained consciousness, and kept functioning as though death had never occurred. Ethan was not undead. He was not a zombie shambling through the world despite being killed. He was mold-shaped like Ethan Winters, running on Ethan's memories, thinking Ethan's thoughts, convinced it was still the man who had died, and he had no idea. The Megamycete's ability to perfectly replicate organisms extends beyond humans. Miranda discovered she could alter her own form at will, taking the shape of animals, people, even inanimate objects if she concentrated enough. The mold had given her access to genetic blueprints stored in the archive. She could manifest crow forms by accessing bird DNA the fungus had consumed. She could impersonate Mia Winters by studying Mia's genetic structure and reshaping her own mold cells to match. Dimitrescu's daughters took this even further. Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela could disperse their entire bodies into swarms of flies. Each individual fly retained a fragment of their consciousness. The swarm acted with coordinated intelligence because every insect was part of a distributed mind, connected through the same mycelial network that connected them to the Megamycete itself. This creates a philosophical problem that Village never directly addresses, but looms over every revelation about the mold. If consciousness can be copied and stored in fungal tissue, if bodies can be replaced cell by cell without interrupting awareness, if distributed swarms can maintain unified identity across hundreds of separate organisms, then what exactly is a person? Ethan Winters had Ethan's memories. He made choices Ethan would make. He loved Mia the way Ethan loved her. He fought to save his daughter because that is what Ethan would do. By every measure that matters for lived experience, he was Ethan Winters. But biologically, the man who married Mia had been dead since 2017. The person who saved Rose was mold-shaped like a dead man. Does that distinction matter? If the copy is perfect, if the consciousness is continuous, if no outside observer could tell the difference, is there actually a difference? The Megamycete does not answer this question, because the Megamycete does not think in terms of individual identity. It is a colony organism, a hive. The fungus stores every consciousness it has ever consumed, but from the Megamycete's perspective, those are not separate people. They are inputs, patterns, information that can be accessed, copied, transferred, or discarded depending on what serves the colony's survival. Miranda understood this intellectually. She knew that the Megamycete viewed Eva as information storage, not as her daughter, but she did not care. If she could find a vessel compatible enough to host Eva's stored consciousness, if she could trigger the right biological conditions, the information points would become a person again. Her daughter would wake up inside a new body, and that was all that mattered. This is where the Cadou enters the story, and where Miranda's century of experiments begins producing the lords, the lichens, and a trail of failed test subjects that would fill every graveyard in the region. Chapter 2. The Birth of Mother Miranda. Miranda was not always the figure the villagers would come to worship. Before the cave, before the Megamycete, before she became Mother Miranda, prophet of the Black God, she was a biologist living in a remote mountain village, raising a daughter named Eva. The details of Miranda's early life are sparse. We know she was born sometime in the late 1800s. We know she had training in biology, which was unusual for women in that era, particularly in isolated rural communities. We know she gave birth to Ava in 1909, and we know that 10 years later the Spanish flu reached her village and killed her daughter. The Spanish flu pandemic hit Europe between 1918 and 1920. It infected roughly 500 million people. It killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million. Entire towns lost 20% of their population in a matter of weeks. Hospitals overflowed. Morgues ran out of space. Mass graves became necessary because individual burials could not keep pace with the death toll. The village where Miranda lived suffered catastrophic losses. The cemetery filled to capacity almost immediately. Survivors had to bury their dead in hastily designated overflow sites. The Potter's Field, an area outside the village proper, became one of these emergency burial grounds. Bodies went into the ground with minimal ceremony because there was no time for anything else. The living were too busy caring for the dying to properly mourn those already lost. Eva was 10 years old when the flu took her. Miranda, trained in biology, understanding viral mechanisms better than most people in that village, could do nothing. She watched her daughter deteriorate, fever, respiratory distress, the characteristic bleeding from mucous membranes that marked severe cases. Eva died slowly enough that Miranda had time to understand she was dying, and quickly enough that no intervention could save her. Miranda buried her daughter in the Potter's Field. Then she walked into the mountains intending to die. Grief of this magnitude does not follow predictable patterns. Some people shut down emotionally, creating distance between themselves and the pain until functioning becomes possible again. Others channel the loss into action, building something meaningful from the wreckage. Miranda chose neither. She walked into a cave system near the village carrying the kind of despair that makes death feel like resolution rather than tragedy. The cave Miranda entered was not a random choice. Local folklore described it as cursed. Villagers avoided the area. Stories passed down through generations warned about people who entered the caves and never returned, or who came back changed in ways that made them dangerous. Miranda, in her grief, probably hoped the stories were true. Whatever lived in those caves could do what the flu had done: end things. What she found instead was the Megamycete. The central mass sits in a massive underground chamber. Descriptions from those who have seen it compare the structure to a massive root system, tendrils spreading across stone, pulsing with faint bioluminescence. The fungus had grown large enough over millennia that it had become architectural. The chamber itself seemed shaped by the organism's expansion. Miranda touched it, and in that moment everything changed. The experience of consciousness flooding is difficult to translate into language because human minds are not designed to process multiple, simultaneous perspectives. You experience the world through your eyes, your memories, your continuity of self. You cannot suddenly perceive through dozens of other viewpoints while maintaining coherent awareness of your own identity. The brain has no mechanism for managing that kind of sensory overload, but the Megamycete forced it anyway. Miranda perceived memories from people who had died decades ago, centuries ago. She experienced their deaths, their births, their mundane moments, and their significant ones. The fungus did not distinguish between important and trivial. Everything got archived with equal fidelity. She felt what it was like to freeze to death on a mountain pass, to die in childbirth, to bleed out from a knife wound in a village dispute, to simply fall asleep as an old person and not wake up. And among all those archived consciousnesses, among all those stored neural patterns, she found Eva. Her daughter's memories were there, incomplete, fragmented in ways that suggested the Megamycete had only partially absorbed her before decomposition progressed too far, but recognizable. Miranda could perceive moments from Eva's short life: birthday celebrations, playing in the village square, the final days of illness. The revelation was immediate and devastating. Miranda's grief, Instead of finding resolution, found purpose. If the Megamycete could preserve Ava, perhaps it could restore her. Miranda did not die in that cave. She emerged transformed. The Megamycete had infected her during the contact, mold spores entering her bloodstream, beginning the cellular replacement process. But unlike most organisms, Miranda's body proved remarkably compatible with the infection. Instead of dying or mutating into something unrecognizable, she gained abilities that seemed supernatural. She discovered she could reshape her body, elongate limbs, manifest claws, change her appearance to mimic other people. Her aging process stopped entirely. Wounds that should have been fatal healed within hours. The mold had not destroyed Miranda. It had made her functionally immortal, and it had given her the knowledge to potentially bring her daughter back. Miranda returned to the village carrying abilities no one in that community could explain through any framework except religious miracle. The Spanish flu was still killing people. The village was desperate, and Miranda, infected with an organism that granted disease resistance, began infecting others. She presented it as healing. The Black God, she called it. A divine entity living beneath the mountain that could cure illness. She convinced sick villagers to undergo a ritual where she would implant them with mold spores. Some of them actually recovered from the flu. The mold's presence gave their immune systems enough boost to fight off the viral infection. Others were not so fortunate. The mold infection triggered mutations. People who received Miranda's cure began changing. Bone structure warped, skin texture altered, cognitive function degraded. Within weeks, some of the cured had transformed into something barely recognizable as human. Miranda cast them out. The mutations, she claimed, were signs of moral failure, punishment from the Black God for secret sins. The transformed individuals were driven from the village into the ruins of an old fortress in the mountains. They became lichens, wolf-like creatures that retained fragments of their former memories, but had lost the capacity for complex thought. The villagers who remained human interpreted their survival as divine favor. They abandoned Christianity entirely. Within months, Miranda had established herself as Mother Miranda, prophet of the Black God, spiritual leader of a cult built around her interpretation. This was not delusion. Miranda knew exactly what the Black God actually was. She understood the biological mechanisms behind every miracle she performed. But religious framing gave her something biology could not control. Villagers who viewed her as a prophet would submit to experimentation. They would resist if presented as science. Faith made them compliant. For the next century, Miranda would use that compliance to conduct experiments that make Umbrella's atrocities look restrained by comparison. She created the Cadou, a parasitic organism derived from nematodes that had been exposed to the mold. The parasite could be implanted surgically into a host's abdominal cavity. Once inside, it would spread mold infection in a more controlled manner than random spore exposure. The goal was to create a vessel compatible enough to host Ava's archived consciousness. Most test subjects died. Their bodies rejected the Cadou, triggering immune responses that led to organ failure. Others survived the implantation, but mutated into lichens. Their bodies integrated the parasite, but their minds degraded into animal aggression. Occasionally, a subject would survive with their cognition mostly intact, but develop mutations so severe they could no longer function in human society. These became the Lords: Alcina Dimitrescu, Salvatore Moreau, Donna Beneviento, Carl Heisenberg, 4 individuals who bonded with the Cadou in ways that granted them superhuman abilities while maintaining enough mental coherence to serve Miranda's purposes. None of them were suitable vessels for Eva. Dimitrescu's blood disease had worsened rather than been cured. Moreau's mutations left him physically grotesque and mentally unstable. Beneviento's pre-existing mental health issues amplified into debilitating conditions. Heisenberg developed magnetic organs that made him physiologically incompatible. They were failures, but they were useful failures. Miranda granted them authority over different territories: Castle Dimitrescu, House Beneviento, the reservoir, the factory. Each lord ruled their domain, conducting parallel research, creating their own bioweapons, searching for the vessel Miranda desperately needed. But the real revelation is not what Miranda did to the lords. It is what she taught to Oswell Spencer in the 1950s. That single mentorship would reshape global history in ways Miranda never intended, but directly enabled. That explains the cult's creation. But it does not explain why someone like Oswell Spencer, heir to British aristocracy, trained physician, future founder of Umbrella Corporation, would seek out an isolated village in Eastern Europe to learn from a woman conducting illegal human experiments in a cave. The answer is more uncomfortable than you might expect. And it starts with Spencer getting lost in the mountains during what should have been a routine hiking trip. Chapter 3. Engineering Compatibility. The word Cadou is Romanian. It means gift. Miranda's choice of terminology reveals how she conceptualized her experiments. She was not inflicting parasites on unwilling subjects. She was bestowing gifts, opportunities to serve a higher purpose, the chance to become vessels for something greater than themselves. The villagers accepted this framing because Miranda had spent decades establishing herself as their spiritual authority. By the time she began widespread Cadou implantation in the mid-20th century, multiple generations had been raised to view her as Mother Miranda, prophet of the Black God, the woman who had saved them from the Spanish flu. Questioning her was not just rebellion against authority, it was heresy against their entire belief system. Miranda's journals document the creation process. She started with nematodes, parasitic worms that naturally infect host organisms by burrowing into tissue and establishing themselves in the digestive system or muscle tissue. The worms themselves are unremarkable. Standard parasites that cause discomfort and malnutrition but rarely kill healthy hosts. Miranda exposed the nematodes directly to concentrated mold samples. Most of the worms died. Their simple nervous systems could not handle the cellular restructuring the mold triggered, but a small percentage survived. These survivors had integrated mold tissue into their own cellular structure. They became carriers, living delivery mechanisms that could introduce mold infection in a controlled, surgical manner. The Cadou looked visually similar to the Megamycete itself, a dark, root-like structure with tendrils that would extend once implanted. The parasite needed to be placed surgically because it lacked mobility on its own. Miranda would cut open a subject's abdomen, position the Cadou near major organs, and suture the incision. Then she would monitor what happened over the following weeks. Once inside a host, tendrils extended through tissue, reaching into the bloodstream, the lymphatic system, eventually the nervous system. The parasite absorbed the host's DNA. It cataloged their genetic structure, and then it began introducing mold cells that would gradually replace the host's original tissue. The process was agonizing. Subjects described feeling their organs shifting, bone structure changing, skin texture altering. The Cadou did not simply infect, it rewrote the host's biology from the inside out. Most people could not survive this rewriting. Their immune systems recognized the mold cells as foreign invaders and mounted aggressive responses. Inflammation would spike throughout the body. Organs would begin failing as the immune assault damaged tissue faster than the mold could replace it. Death typically occurred within 2 to 3 weeks of implantation. Others survived the initial integration, but experienced mutations so severe their minds could not process what their bodies had become. These subjects transformed into lichens, their bone structure elongated, joints reversed, teeth extended into fangs, Hair growth accelerated across their entire bodies until they resembled the werewolf legends that had haunted European folklore for centuries. But the most disturbing aspect of lichen transformation was not the physical change. It was the mental degradation. Lichens retained fragments of their human memories. They could sometimes recognize faces from their previous lives. They demonstrated problem-solving abilities that pure animals lack. But the cognitive capacity for language, for complex planning, for moral reasoning had been destroyed. Miranda documented this loss in clinical terms. The Cadou infection, when it produced lichens, appeared to preserve brainstem function and limbic system responses while destroying most higher cortical processing. The subjects could feel fear, rage, hunger. They could form pack hierarchies and coordinate basic hunting strategies, but they could not articulate thoughts. They could not question their circumstances. They could not remember who they used to be in any coherent narrative sense. They had become exactly what Miranda needed them to be. Disposable test subjects who demonstrated the Cadou's mutagenic potential without requiring continued care or producing moral complications. If a lichen died during further experiments, Miranda felt no guilt. The person they used to be was already gone. She cast them out to the old fortress ruins, hundreds of failed experiments living in a medieval stronghold, emerging occasionally to hunt livestock from the village. The villagers viewed them as divine punishment, evidence of what happened to those unworthy of Mother Miranda's gifts. Fear kept the community compliant, but occasionally, very rarely, a subject would bond with the Cadou in a way that preserved their cognitive function while granting them abilities that seemed to violate biological law. The four lords emerged from decades of experimentation. They were not the first subjects to survive with intelligence intact. Miranda's research notes reference at least 4 others who demonstrated similar compatibility. But those earlier candidates had either died from complications years after implantation or had proven mentally unstable. Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Moreau, and Beneviento represented the best results Miranda had achieved after a century of trying. Each had bonded with the Cadou in unique ways that reflected their pre-existing biology. Their mutations were not random. The parasite had amplified and twisted traits that already existed in their genetic makeup. Understanding how each lord transformed requires examining what they were before Miranda implanted them. Because the Cadou does not create abilities from nothing. It takes existing biological potential and pushes it to extremes that natural evolution would never produce. Chapter 4. The Four Lords. Useful Failures. Alcina Dimitrescu was born into nobility sometime around 1914. Her family controlled Castle Dimitrescu and the surrounding wine territories for generations. She performed as a jazz singer under the stage name Miss D, fronting a band called the Pal Boys. She had wealth, status, artistic talent, and a genetic time bomb that would eventually destroy her. Dimitrescu suffered from a hereditary blood disease. The specific condition is never named, but symptoms described in Miranda's notes suggest something similar to porphyria or a severe clotting disorder. Her body could not properly regulate blood production. She required regular transfusions to maintain stable health. When Miranda approached her about Cadou implantation, Dimitrescu was 44 years old and aware her condition was worsening. The promise of a cure, delivered by the woman the village worshipped as a prophet, must have seemed like divine intervention. The Cadou did not cure her blood disease. It made it catastrophically worse. The parasite integrated with her existing condition rather than correcting it. Her body began requiring massive quantities of human blood to sustain the mold infection. Not animal blood, not synthetic substitutes. Human blood, specifically, consumed fresh. The Cadou had created a biological dependency that turned Dimitrescu into exactly what folklore would call a vampire, but the infection granted her abilities that made acquiring blood feasible. She gained regenerative capabilities that made her nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. She developed retractable claws formed from calcified bone that could extend from her fingernails at will. Her aging stopped completely, and she began growing. The mutation triggered continuous growth hormone production. Dimitrescu's height increased gradually over decades until she reached 9 feet 6 inches tall. Her body maintained proportions well enough that she did not appear grotesquely stretched. She simply looked like a woman whose scale had been increased by nearly 50%. Miranda's notes describe Dimitrescu as the first subject to achieve successful Cadou integration while maintaining cognitive function. This made Dimitrescu feel special, chosen. She viewed herself as Miranda's favorite, the lord closest to achieving what Mother Miranda truly wanted. This perception created fierce loyalty and desperate need for continued approval. Dimitrescu took over Castle Dimitrescu and resumed the family wine business as a cover for her actual activities. She would lure young women to the castle under pretense of employment: maids, kitchen staff, groundskeepers. Once they arrived, Dimitrescu would drain their blood over extended periods, keeping victims alive as long as possible to maintain freshness. The corpses that resulted from this process became raw material for another of Miranda's experiments. Dimitrescu would drain the blood, then introduce Cadou parasites into the drained corpses. The reanimated bodies became moroi and samsa, bat-like creatures that haunted the castle grounds, serving as both guardians and disposal mechanisms for evidence. Dimitrescu's 3 daughters, Bella, Cassandra, Daniela, were not her biological children. They were constructs. Miranda had created them by implanting Cadou parasites into corpses, then introducing insect DNA during the reanimation process. The result was 3 beings who could shift between human form and dispersed fly swarms. Each daughter maintained individual personality and memory, despite being able to scatter into hundreds of separate insects. This suggested the mold network allowed distributed consciousness across multiple physical forms. The flies were not independent organisms being controlled. They were all part of a single mind experiencing reality through hundreds of simultaneous viewpoints. But Dimitrescu's mutation, for all its power, had made her unsuitable as Eva's vessel. The blood dependency, the extreme height, the violent tendencies that came with constant hunger. Miranda judged these traits as incompatible with resurrecting a 10-year-old girl who had died from the flu. Dimitrescu remained useful for research purposes, but she would never become what Miranda truly needed. Salvatore Moreau represented the opposite end of the compatibility spectrum. Where Dimitrescu had maintained beauty and grace despite her mutation, Moreau had become grotesque. Moreau belonged to a family that ran a medical clinic near the reservoir north of the village. Evidence suggests either he or a family member had been physicians. His body bears tattoos that indicate he may have worked as a sailor or fisherman before Miranda's experiments. A jellyfish on his shoulder with the word "Mother" written inside, an anchor on his forearm, the markings of someone who had spent significant time at sea. When the Cadou implanted in Moreau, his body underwent transformations that made him barely recognizable as human. His back developed a massive hump composed of tumor-like growths. His skin took on a sickly gray-green tone. His hands and feet became webbed. Gills formed on his neck, his teeth elongated into sharp, irregular fangs. The mutations gave him aquatic capabilities. He could breathe underwater, survive in cold temperatures that would kill normal humans. His body produced enzymes that allowed him to digest raw fish and decomposing matter without getting sick. The Cadou had essentially turned him into an amphibious predator optimized for life in and around water. But the mental effects were even more devastating than the physical changes. Moreau's brain function degraded significantly. He retained language ability and emotional responses, but his cognitive processing became childlike. He fixated on obtaining Miranda's approval with desperate intensity that bordered on pathological. Miranda's notes describe Moreau's mental state as surprisingly low, even before Cadou implantation. The parasite had not created his intellectual limitations. It had amplified existing deficits. This made him easy to manipulate, but unsuitable as a vessel. Eva had been sharp, curious, intellectually engaged with the world. Moreau's mind could never host that kind of consciousness. He flooded the entire northern section of the village to create an environment his mutated body could thrive in. The reservoir became his domain. He lived in primitive conditions in a shack built from salvage materials, spending most of his time submerged in water, emerging only to feed or when Miranda summoned him. The other lords looked down on him. Dimitrescu called him and the others miscreants. Beneviento's doll, Angie, openly mocked his appearance, calling him ugly. Heisenberg treated him with barely concealed contempt. Moreau knew they despised him. He knew even Miranda viewed him as a failure, but he continued serving her with unwavering devotion because he had nothing else. His transformation revealed something crucial about the Cadou's effects. The parasite did not simply mutate bodies. It amplified whatever psychological traits existed before infection. Dimitrescu's pride became narcissistic need for validation. Moreau's insecurity became desperate, childlike dependency. The mutations reflected inner states as much as genetic structures. Donna Beneviento demonstrated this principle even more clearly. Her mutations were subtle compared to the other lords. Physically, she appeared almost human. But psychologically, the Cadou had taken existing mental health conditions and amplified them into something that made her one of the most dangerous lords despite her unremarkable appearance. Beneviento came from a family of doll makers. House Beneviento had operated a doll manufacturing business for generations. She inherited both the house and the trade after her family members either died or were used as Miranda's test subjects. By the time Miranda implanted her with the Cadou, Donna was the last surviving Beneviento. She already suffered from severe mental illness before the implantation. The specific diagnosis is never stated, but symptoms described in documents suggest something involving profound social anxiety, possible psychotic features, and communication difficulties so severe she was functionally mute. The Cadou did not cure these conditions. It gave her the ability to weaponize them. Beneviento gained two primary abilities from her mutation. First, she could produce a pollen that caused vivid, terrifying hallucinations in anyone who inhaled it. The pollen worked by triggering fear responses in the amygdala, while simultaneously suppressing the prefrontal cortex's ability to distinguish reality from imagination. Victims would experience their worst fears as though they were actually happening. Second, she developed an almost parasitic connection with a specific doll she had crafted, Angie. The doll moved independently, spoke with its own voice, demonstrated personality traits distinct from Donna herself. But Angie was not possessed or separately conscious. The doll functioned as an extension of Donna's fractured psyche, a way for her to interact with the world without having to speak directly. Beneviento would hide in her mansion, pumping hallucinogenic pollen through the ventilation system, forcing intruders to face psychological torment designed around their specific traumas. She never engaged in direct combat. She did not need to. The pollen did the work. Victims would kill themselves, trying to escape horrors that existed only in their contaminated minds. Miranda judged Beneviento unsuitable for Ava's consciousness because the mental instability had only worsened with Cadou integration. The parasite had not restored psychological health. It had given someone deeply unwell the biological tools to inflict her internal suffering on everyone around her. Carl Heisenberg represented the only Lord who understood what Miranda actually was and actively resented her for it. Heisenberg came from a family that operated a factory in the mountains, mining operations, heavy industrial equipment. The family business involved extracting resources from the region and processing them into sellable materials. He inherited control of the factory, and when Miranda implanted him with the Cadou, his mutation aligned perfectly with the industrial environment he inhabited. Heisenberg developed magnetism. His body contained organs that could generate powerful electromagnetic fields. He could sense metal objects within a certain radius, manipulate them telekinetically, reshape them through magnetic pressure alone. He could levitate himself by manipulating the metal in his own skeleton. He had become a living magnet with conscious control over one of the fundamental forces of physics. He used this ability to create an army. Soldats, cybernetic corpses animated through a combination of Cadou infection and mechanical implants. He would steal bodies from the village cemetery, implant them with parasites, outfit them with metal components, and use his magnetic control to puppet them as soldiers. The Soldat army represented Heisenberg's plan to overthrow Miranda. He was the only Lord who recognized that once Miranda found a suitable vessel for Eva, she would have no further use for any of them. The century of experiments would end, and the lords who had served her purposes would become liabilities to be eliminated. Heisenberg attempted to recruit Ethan Winters into this rebellion. His pitch was pragmatic. Miranda had manipulated Ethan into killing the other lords one by one. Dimitrescu, Beneviento, Moreau. Each death recovered a flask containing part of Rose's body. Ethan was doing exactly what Miranda wanted, removing obstacles, consolidating the resources needed for her ceremony. Heisenberg offered an alternative: use Rose as a weapon against Miranda. The child's unique mold composition made her powerful enough to potentially destroy Mother Miranda if properly weaponized. Ethan refused. He was not going to let anyone use his daughter as a bioweapon, regardless of their justifications. The refusal sealed Heisenberg's fate, but his awareness sets him apart from the other lords. Dimitrescu craved Miranda's approval. Moreau desperately needed her validation. Beneviento served her orders without question. Only Heisenberg saw through the cult mythology to recognize Miranda as exactly what she was: a scientist willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone to resurrect a daughter who had been dead for over a century. He was still a monster. The soldats he created were corpses violated and reanimated without consent. The experiments he conducted in his factory were brutal and ethically indefensible. But Heisenberg at least understood the system he was trapped in and tried to fight it. Miranda viewed all four lords as failures. Useful failures that helped her research progress, but failures nonetheless. None of them could serve as Ava's vessel. Their mutations were too severe, their minds too damaged, their bodies too incompatible with the consciousness Miranda wanted to resurrect. She needed something different, someone whose mold composition was perfect from birth, someone created from two parents who had both been so thoroughly infected that their child would be mold at a cellular level from the moment of conception. She needed Rosemary Winters. But Rose only existed because of a chain of events Miranda had set in motion decades earlier without realizing the consequences. That chain began in the 1950s when a young British medical student got lost in the mountains, and Miranda rescued him. That student's name was Oswell E. Spencer, and what he learned from Miranda would create Umbrella Corporation, the T-virus, and every bioweapon disaster the Resident Evil franchise has documented. But understanding Spencer's connection to Miranda requires understanding why he was in Eastern Europe at all, and what he was looking for when he stumbled into that isolated village where a grieving mother had been conducting illegal human experiments for 30 years? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how institutional horror begins. It does not start with evil corporations. It starts with individual ambition meeting teachable methodology. Spencer was not corrupted by Miranda. He found exactly the mentor he needed to achieve goals he already had. Chapter 5. The Seed of Umbrella. Oswell E. Spencer was born around 1923 into British aristocracy. The Spencer family held significant wealth and social standing. They owned estates, collected art, moved in circles where connections mattered more than competence. Spencer grew up understanding that resources and social position could purchase opportunities unavailable to ordinary people. By the 1950s, Spencer was a university student training as a physician. He attended school with two men who would become his closest associates and eventual co-founders of Umbrella Corporation, Edward Ashford and James Marcus. The three formed what they called a eugenics circle, a group dedicated to exploring how human evolution could be directed rather than left to natural selection. This was not fringe ideology for the time period. Eugenics was mainstream scientific discourse in the mid-20th century. Universities taught it. Governments funded research into it. The concept that humanity could be improved through selective breeding or genetic intervention enjoyed widespread academic support. Spencer's particular vision went further than most eugenicists. He viewed the current state of humanity as fundamentally flawed, self-destructive, caught in cycles of war and suffering that would inevitably lead to species-level catastrophe. He believed the only solution was forced evolution, not through breeding programs that would take generations, through viral mechanisms that could rewrite human biology directly. He needed a working model, proof that organisms could be fundamentally altered through controlled infection, evidence that mutation could be directed rather than random. He needed someone who had actually achieved this transformation. In the early 1950s, Spencer took a solo hiking trip through Eastern Europe. The stated purpose was recreational, exploring unfamiliar terrain, experiencing cultures different from British aristocratic society. But Spencer's choice of destination suggests he had heard rumors, stories about an isolated village in the mountains, whispers of miraculous healings and strange mutations. He got lost. Spencer had no experience navigating mountain terrain. The weather turned severe. He collapsed on a snow-covered road, suffering from exposure and likely hypothermia. He would have died if Miranda had not found him. She brought him to the village, treated his injuries, and recognized something in this young British medical student that made her decide he was worth teaching. Miranda's decision to take Spencer as her student reveals her psychological state 30 years after losing Eva. She had spent 3 decades conducting experiments in isolation. The villagers worshipped her, but worship is not intellectual engagement. They accepted her explanations without questioning. They followed her instructions without understanding the science behind them. Miranda was brilliant, but she had no peers, no one who could discuss her research at her level. Spencer offered that engagement. He understood biology, he asked informed questions, he grasped the implications of what the Megamycete represented, and crucially, he had resources Miranda lacked: wealth, connections, access to equipment, and research facilities far beyond what she could assemble in cave laboratories. Miranda taught him everything: the Megamycete's properties, the mold's ability to replace cells while maintaining consciousness, the Cadou's mechanism for controlled infection, horizontal gene transfer, consciousness storage, the biological principles that made resurrection theoretically possible. Spencer absorbed it all. He took extensive notes. He asked for demonstrations. Miranda showed him the lichens, the early attempts at creating vessels, the failures that resulted when hosts rejected the parasite. She walked him through her methodology, the surgical techniques, the monitoring protocols, the markers that indicated successful integration versus catastrophic rejection. But as Spencer's understanding deepened, fundamental differences in their visions became apparent. Miranda wanted one thing: Eva, resurrection of her specific daughter, using her specific stored consciousness. Every experiment served this singular goal. The lichens, the lords, the century of research, all of it aimed at creating the conditions necessary to bring back one little girl who had died in 1919. Spencer saw something completely different when he looked at Miranda's work. He saw the mechanism for human evolution itself. If the mold could rewrite biology, if it could grant superhuman abilities, if it could make someone functionally immortal, then it could transform humanity as a species. Not just resurrect individuals, create a new form of human existence. The ideological split was inevitable. Miranda was driven by grief. Spencer was driven by ambition. She wanted to undo death. He wanted to direct life. She worked in secret because her goals required isolation. He wanted to build an empire because his goals required infrastructure. They parted ways. Spencer left the village sometime in the mid-1950s, but he maintained contact with Miranda. Letters found in her laboratory confirm they continued corresponding even after Spencer founded Umbrella Corporation. Spencer returned to his university a changed man. The hiking trip had given him exactly what he needed: a working model, proof that directed mutation was possible, evidence that viral mechanisms could fundamentally alter organisms in ways that natural evolution would never produce. He shared his findings with Ashford and Marcus. The three began planning. They needed a naturally occurring virus with mutagenic properties, something they could study, weaponize, and eventually use to trigger the evolutionary leap Spencer envisioned. That search led them to West Africa, to a flower called the Stairway to the Sun, to the discovery of the progenitor virus, and to the founding of Umbrella Pharmaceuticals in 1968. The Umbrella Corporation logo is not original design. Spencer took the symbol representing the four houses in Miranda's village, the heraldic crests of the founding families: Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Beneviento, Moreau. He placed them in an octagonal pattern with an umbrella shape in the center. This choice was deliberate. Spencer viewed Umbrella as a continuation of Miranda's work, an industrialized version of her cave experiments. What she had accomplished with handheld surgical tools and makeshift laboratories, he would achieve with state-of-the-art research facilities and unlimited funding. Everything that followed traces directly back to what Spencer learned from Miranda: the T-virus, the creation of bioweapons, the Arklay Mountain Laboratory, Raccoon City, Wesker. All of it became possible because a grieving mother taught a British medical student how to mutate organisms through parasitic infection. Miranda never intended this outcome. She had taught Spencer out of loneliness and intellectual curiosity. She wanted someone who understood her research, someone she could discuss complex biological mechanisms with. She had no investment in Spencer's vision of forced human evolution, but she had given him the knowledge to pursue that vision anyway, and that knowledge, passed from mentor to student in an isolated mountain village, would eventually cause more death and suffering than the Spanish flu pandemic that started this entire chain of events. The connection between Miranda and Spencer reveals something fundamental about how institutional horror propagates. It does not require evil masterminds coordinating elaborate conspiracies. It requires people with knowledge teaching people with ambition. It requires brilliant minds pursuing incompatible goals, using compatible methods. It requires grief and vision and scientific curiosity all becoming tangled together, until the boundaries between noble purpose and catastrophic harm dissolve completely. Spencer is dead now, killed by Albert Wesker in 2006. Umbrella Corporation collapsed in 2003. But the knowledge Spencer learned from Miranda persists. It passed to the connections, to Tricell, to every organization that has attempted to weaponize biology in the Resident Evil universe. And it came full circle in 2017 when the connections created Eveline, a bioweapon designed using mold samples Miranda had provided. Eveline infected the Baker family in Louisiana, and Ethan Winters, trying to rescue his wife from that infection, was killed by Jack Baker in the guest house. That death should have been the end of Ethan's story, but the mold had other plans. And what happened to Ethan in the Baker estate would eventually create the one thing Miranda had been searching for across an entire century: a perfect vessel for Ava, born from two mold-infected parents, composed of fungal tissue from the moment of conception, the child Miranda needed to complete her resurrection ceremony. Rosemary Winters existed because Spencer learned from Miranda, because Spencer created Umbrella, because Umbrella's collapse led to the connections, because the connections created Eveline, because Eveline infected the Bakers, because Ethan died trying to save Mia. Cause and effect, forming a loop that connected 1919 to 2021. A century of bioweapon research and human experimentation, creating exactly the conditions necessary for a grieving mother to finally have what she wanted. But Ethan would not let that happen. Because even though he was dead, even though he was mold-shaped like a man, even though every cell in his body was fungus mimicking human tissue, he was still a father trying to save his daughter. And that distinction between what you are biologically and who you choose to be becomes the central question Village refuses to answer definitively. Chapter 6. Ethan Winters, the Dead Man, Walking. Ethan Winters died on July 24, 2017 in the guest house of the Baker estate. This is not speculation. This is documented fact confirmed by Miranda's research, by Eveline's testimony in Village, and by medical records that were never properly examined. The death was quick. Jack Baker caught Ethan trying to rescue Mia. There was a brief struggle. Jack overpowered him easily because Jack was infected with Eveline's mold and had superhuman strength. Jack stomped on Ethan's head. The force of the impact crushed his skull, caused immediate brain death. Ethan was clinically dead for several minutes. He woke up being dragged into the main house, alive, conscious, aware. The revival was not miraculous. It was biological. The Baker estate was saturated with mold from Eveline's presence. The fungus had spread through the walls, the floors, the ventilation system. When Ethan died, mold spores entered his body through the wound Jack had created. The fungus recognized a fresh corpse, an opportunity to preserve consciousness and replicate biological structure. The mold did what it had been doing for thousands of years in the cave beneath Miranda's village. It copied Ethan. Every cell, every neuron, every synaptic connection that made Ethan's mind function. The fungus created a perfect imitation of Ethan Winters using his own genetic blueprint and the neural patterns that were fading from his dying brain. Then it stood the body up and restarted consciousness. Ethan woke up thinking he had merely been knocked unconscious. He had no memory of dying because the mold copy had been created from the moment before death, the last seconds of brain activity before everything went dark. The copy did not know it was a copy. This explains everything that should have been impossible about Ethan's time in the Baker estate. When Mia cut his hand off with a chainsaw, he reattached it with basic first aid supplies. The wound healed within hours. A severed hand should not reattach that easily. Tendons do not reconnect on their own. Nerves do not regenerate that quickly, but mold tissue can. When Jack stabbed him repeatedly during the dinner scene, Ethan survived injuries that would have caused a normal person to bleed out within minutes. When Marguerite's insects infected him with venom, His body processed toxins that should have been lethal. When he poured first aid liquid on his arm and watched it heal, he was not using medicine. He was feeding mold cells the chemical nutrients they needed to accelerate repair. The mold had made him functionally immortal. As long as the fungal network remained intact, as long as enough cells survived to maintain the pattern that made Ethan aware he could recover from almost any injury. Severed limbs, impalement, massive blood loss. None of it would kill him because he was not human tissue anymore. He was fungus shaped like Ethan Winters. But the most disturbing aspect of this transformation is that Ethan never noticed. He continued thinking of himself as human. When he looked in mirrors, he saw his own face. When he touched his skin, it felt like skin. His body performed every function a human body should perform. Breathing, digestion, temperature regulation. The mold had created such a perfect copy that even the copy itself could not tell the difference. The BSAA medical examination after Dolby should have revealed the truth. Ethan underwent a full physical assessment, blood tests, tissue samples, imaging scans. The doctors removed a mycelial cluster from his body, physical evidence of mold infection. But they missed what it meant. They identified the fungal growth and removed it. But they did not test whether Ethan's individual cells were actually human. They assumed the mold was a foreign organism that had colonized his body. They did not consider the possibility that his entire body was the foreign organism, that every cell they were examining was fungal tissue imitating human cells. This failure reveals something crucial about how the mold functions. It does not trigger immune responses the way normal infections do. When a virus or bacteria enters your body, your immune system recognizes foreign proteins and mounts defenses, fever, inflammation, white blood cell production. Your body fights the invader because it can identify what does not belong. Mold cells bypass this recognition entirely. The horizontal gene transfer allows them to copy the surface proteins that mark cells as self. The fungal imitations carry the same chemical signatures as the original cells. The immune system scans them, finds familiar markers, and categorizes them as native tissue. No response needed. This is why Ethan's body accepted the mold replacement without rejection. He had no immune reaction because, as far as his immune system could determine, nothing foreign had entered. The cells dying and being replaced looked identical to the cells they were replacing. The transition from human to fungus happened so seamlessly that even biological testing could not detect it. Ethan lived for 3 years after Dolve without knowing he was dead. He married Mia. They had a child together. He worked as a systems engineer. He attended social functions. He existed as a normal person because, from his perspective, from everyone's perspective, he was a normal person. Mia knew. She had been infected with Eveline's mold for years before Ethan arrived at the Baker estate. She understood what the fungus could do. She saw Ethan survive injuries that should have killed him. She watched his severed hand reattach. She knew he had died and been resurrected by the same organism that had infected her. But she never told him. Whether this was mercy or cowardice remains unclear. Perhaps she thought the knowledge would destroy him psychologically. Perhaps she wanted to preserve the illusion of normalcy for both of them. Perhaps she was simply too traumatized by her own experiences to discuss what had happened. They moved to Eastern Europe under BSAA witness protection. Chris Redfield arranged the relocation. Ethan and Mia were considered victims of bioterrorism. The BSAA provided them with new identities, a house in a remote location, and regular monitoring to ensure they remained uninfected. Except they were infected. They had been infected since Dolve. The monitoring missed it because the tests were not designed to detect organisms that could perfectly mimic human cells. The BSAA was looking for standard bioweapon markers. T-virus antibodies, G-virus mutations, mold spore counts. They found nothing alarming because the mold had integrated so completely that standard screening could not identify it. Rosemary Winters was born in this context, a child conceived by two parents who were both fungus wearing human form. Ethan was entirely mold. Every cell in his body was fungal tissue. Mia had been exposed to Eveline's mold. For years, her cells gradually replaced through the same mechanisms that had transformed Ethan. Rose inherited mold composition from both parents. She was not infected after birth. She was mold from the moment of conception. Her entire development occurred in a womb made of fungal cells. Her DNA was a hybrid blueprint that combined Ethan's copied genetics with Mia's infected biology. This made her unique, the first human born from two fully mold-infected parents. The first person whose entire biological existence was fungal from cellular formation onward. She had no pre-infection baseline, no original human tissue that had been replaced. She was mold-shaped like a baby, created from mold shaped like parents. Miranda recognized this immediately when the connections informed her about Rose's existence. They had been monitoring the Winters family because of Mia's previous involvement with Eveline. They knew about the pregnancy, they understood the implications, and they contacted Miranda because she had provided the original mold samples that created Eveline in the first place. Miranda saw Rose's genetic profile and realized this was exactly what she had been searching for across a century of experiments, a vessel compatible enough to host Eva's consciousness. Rose's mold composition was perfect. Her age was correct. Her biology would accept the consciousness transfer that had failed with every other test subject. She began planning the abduction immediately. But she needed a cover story, a way to take Rose without alerting BSAA or triggering an international bioterrorism response. She needed chaos that would obscure her actions, a crisis that would make Rose's disappearance seem like collateral damage rather than targeted kidnapping. Miranda traveled to the Winters home in February 2021. She had practiced her shape-shifting abilities for decades. She could mimic any person whose DNA she had studied. She had obtained Mia's genetic profile through the connections. She transformed herself into a perfect copy of Mia Winters. Then she waited for the right moment to replace the real Mia and take Rose. Chris Redfield complicated everything. His intelligence network had identified irregularities in the Winters family's protection detail, communications from Miranda posing as Mia that did not match Mia's normal patterns, behavioral changes that suggested something wrong. Chris did not know about Miranda specifically, but he knew Mia had been compromised somehow. He made the decision to raid the Winters home. His Hound Wolf squad would extract Ethan and Rose, eliminate the threat, and secure the situation before it escalated. Chris personally shot who he believed was Mia Winters. The woman collapsed. Chris took Ethan and Rose into custody. The transport vehicle crashed in the mountains near Miranda's village. Miranda, having survived Chris's attack because her mold body could regenerate from gunshot wounds, had orchestrated the crash. She grabbed Rose and disappeared. Ethan woke up in the wreckage with his daughter missing and no clear understanding of what had happened. Everything that followed was Miranda's design. She divided Rose's body into 4 parts. Each section was placed in a flask. The flasks were distributed to the 4 lords with instructions to guard them until Miranda completed preparations for the resurrection ceremony. The division served multiple purposes. It ensured Rose's consciousness remained intact while preventing her from being easily rescued. The mold tissue could sustain life even when separated because the consciousness was distributed across the entire mass. Rose was not 4 pieces of a corpse. She was one living entity experiencing existence through 4 separate physical locations simultaneously. This also created the exact scenario Miranda needed. Ethan would search for his daughter. he would be forced to confront each lord to recover each flask. The lords would attempt to kill him. Ethan would kill them in self-defense. Each death would eliminate one of Miranda's creations, clearing the board of complications before the final ceremony. Miranda was using Ethan as an asset, a weapon pointed at obstacles she wanted removed. She manipulated him by providing just enough information to keep him moving in the right direction. The Duke served as her intermediary, explaining what Ethan needed to do without revealing Miranda's ultimate plan. Ethan killed Dimitrescu in her castle. He killed Beneviento in her mansion. He killed Moreau at the reservoir. Each victory recovered a flask. Each flask contained a part of Rose. Ethan believed he was saving his daughter. He did not realize he was completing Miranda's preparations. Only Heisenberg saw through the manipulation. He understood that Miranda was eliminating the lords. He tried to recruit Ethan into a rebellion because he recognized they were both being used. But Ethan refused to trust someone who wanted to weaponize his daughter. He killed Heisenberg in the factory. With all 4 flasks recovered, Ethan had everything Miranda needed. She confronted him at the ceremony site. She explained her plan. Resurrect Eva using Rose as the vessel. Transfer the consciousness stored in the Megamycete into Rose's perfect mold body. Eva would live again. Rose's identity would be overwritten, replaced entirely by Eva's stored personality. Miranda did not frame this as murder because, from her perspective, it was not. Rose was mold-shaped like a baby. Eva was consciousness stored in fungus. Transferring one into the other was simply reorganizing biological information, no different than moving files between computers. But Ethan disagreed, because even though he was mold-shaped like a man, even though every cell in his body was fungus mimicking human tissue, even though he had been dead for years, he was still a father who loved his daughter. Miranda killed him. She ripped his heart out. The injury should have been instantly fatal even for someone made of mold. The heart, even a fungal imitation of a heart, served as a central pump maintaining circulation. Without it, the cellular network could not coordinate. Consciousness should have dispersed. Ethan should have died. Again. Permanently this time. He did not. And the reason why reveals something profound about what consciousness actually is when it is stored in fungal tissue. Ethan woke up in a strange mental space, a place that existed between full death and continued awareness. He encountered Eveline there, not the real Eveline, a fragment of her consciousness that had been absorbed into the Megamycete when she died. That fragment had remained attached to Ethan because he had been infected by her mold strain. Eveline explained what Ethan was. She showed him the moment of his death in the Baker guest house. She walked him through the replacement process. She made him understand that the man who married Mia had died in 2017. The person who saved Rose was a copy, mold wearing Ethan's face. The revelation should have shattered him. Learning you died years ago without knowing it. Learning your entire existence is biological mimicry. Learning your body is fungus and your consciousness is information stored in a mycelial network. That knowledge should destroy any sense of coherent identity. But Ethan accepted it. He processed the information and made a choice. It did not matter what he was made of. It mattered what he chose to do. He was going to save his daughter. He woke up in the Duke's carriage. His body was deteriorating. The heart injury had damaged the fungal network too severely for complete regeneration. He was dying, slowly, visibly. His right hand calcified. Tissue began turning to stone as the mold cells lost cohesion. But he had enough time, enough remaining biological function to reach Miranda, enough awareness left to fight. Chris Redfield and the BSAA had arrived to contain the outbreak. They engaged Miranda directly. Chris shot her in the head, creating an opening. Ethan attacked. The battle was brutal. Miranda had centuries of combat experience. and complete mastery over her mold form. Ethan was a systems engineer whose body was actively falling apart. He won anyway, because he had one advantage Miranda did not account for. He was willing to die again. Miranda had spent a century trying to undo death. Ethan had already accepted it. He just needed to survive long enough to ensure Rose did not become Eva's replacement. He killed Miranda. Her body calcified. The barrier around the ceremony site dissolved. Chris retrieved Rose and Ethan, both of them critically damaged from the battle. Chris explained that Mia was alive. The woman he had shot in the house was Miranda in disguise. The real Mia was safe. Chris also explained there was a bomb. BSAA protocol for Megamycete containment. Destroy the fungal colony completely. Eliminate all infected organisms. Ensure no possibility of the infection spreading. The device would detonate in minutes. It would obliterate the entire village. Ethan could barely stand. His body was calcifying rapidly. He was dying. Again. For real this time. But Chris could still escape with Rose and Mia. He could get them to safety before the detonation. Ethan made the choice every parent hopes they would make, and prays they never have to make. He gave Rose to Chris. He took the detonation trigger. He pushed them away, and he stayed behind. The Megamycete emerged from underground in a final attempt at survival, massive tendrils of fungal tissue reaching towards the escaping aircraft. Ethan triggered the bomb. The explosion destroyed the Megamycete, destroyed the village, and destroyed every remaining cell of fungal tissue that had once been Ethan Winters. He died saving his daughter from becoming a vessel for someone else's lost child. He died ensuring Rose would grow up as herself rather than being erased to resurrect Eva. He died because he chose to be a father even though biologically he was fungus shaped like a man. And that choice is what makes Village's central question so difficult to answer. If consciousness can be perfectly copied, if identity can be transferred between bodies, if awareness can be stored in tissue that was never originally yours, then what makes you you? Ethan had Ethan's memories. He made Ethan's choices. He loved Ethan's family. He sacrificed himself the way Ethan would have. Every aspect of his identity aligned with the man who died in 2017. The only difference was the tissue composition. Human cells versus fungal cells mimicking human cells. Does that difference matter? If the copy is perfect, if the experience is continuous, if the identity persists, is there actually a meaningful distinction between original and imitation? Village refuses to answer definitively, but it does provide one final detail that complicates the question even further. Ethan's consciousness was absorbed by the Megamycete before the explosion. A fragment of his awareness persisted in the fungal network, and years later, when teenage Rose entered the Megamycete's realm during the shadows of Rose DLC, she encountered her father. Not a memory, not a hallucination. Ethan himself, aware and present, existing as stored consciousness in the same fungal archive that held Eva, which means Ethan might not be permanently dead. His body was destroyed, but his mind, his identity, his awareness, all of it exists in whatever fragment of the Megamycete the BSAA salvaged. The same way Eva's consciousness persisted in Miranda's cave for over a century. Ethan Winters might still be recoverable. The same way Miranda tried to recover Eva, through a compatible vessel, through consciousness transfer, through exactly the process Ethan died preventing Miranda from performing on his daughter. But that possibility creates its own horror, because if Ethan can be resurrected by transferring his stored consciousness into a new body, then what happens to whoever originally inhabits that body? Do they get erased the way Rose would have been erased for Eva? Does consciousness transfer require someone else to die so you can live again? These are not hypothetical questions. They are active concerns because Rose exists. Rose has Ethan's genetics. Rose is composed of mold tissue. Rose could theoretically serve as a vessel for her father's consciousness the same way she nearly served as a vessel for Miranda's daughter. Village does not explore this possibility, but it exists. The technology works. The methodology is established. Someone with access to the Megamycete fragment and knowledge of Miranda's research could absolutely attempt to resurrect Ethan Winters. Whether they should is the question. Village leaves hanging. And that unanswered question connects directly to the final mystery the game never explains. The impossible merchant who appears throughout Ethan's journey, providing exactly what he needs exactly when he needs it. The Duke knows things he should not know. He moves through spaces he should not access. He exists in ways that violate basic physical constraints. And when Ethan finally asks what the Duke actually is, the Duke admits he does not know either. That answer is more disturbing than any explanation could be. Chapter 7. The Duke. The Impossible Merchant. The Duke first appears to Ethan outside Castle Dimitrescu. No introduction, no context. Just a massive man sitting in a horse-drawn carriage, surrounded by weapons and supplies, acting as though his presence there is perfectly normal. He greets Ethan by name. He knows about Rose. He understands what Ethan is searching for. He offers to sell weapons and equipment that will help Ethan survive the castle. And when Ethan asks reasonable questions like how the Duke knows who he is or why he is here, the Duke simply says he has been waiting. This is the first indication something is wrong. The Duke knew Ethan was coming. He prepared inventory specifically suited for the threats Ethan would face. He positioned himself at the exact location where Ethan would arrive after escaping Heisenberg's trap. There is no logical way he could have predicted this unless he had information about Miranda's plan that he should not possess. The next time Ethan encounters the Duke is inside Castle Dimitrescu. The merchant has somehow moved his entire carriage, his inventory, and his considerable bulk into the castle, despite the fact that every entrance was either locked or guarded. The Duke claims he has business with the Dimitrescu family. He does not explain what business. He does not explain how he entered. He is simply there. This pattern repeats throughout Village. After Ethan kills Dimitrescu, the Duke appears at the ceremony site. After Beneviento, the Duke is waiting outside her mansion. After Moreau, the Duke appears at the reservoir. After Heisenberg, the Duke is outside the factory. Every single time, the Duke has relocated his entire operation to wherever Ethan happens to be heading next. There are explanations that could make this possible. Perhaps the Duke has multiple carriages positioned at various locations. Perhaps he travels extremely quickly during the periods when Ethan is occupied with fighting lords. Perhaps there are shortcuts through the village that allow rapid movement between territories. But none of these explanations account for how the Duke appears in physically impossible locations. Inside a castle with locked doors. Outside an underground factory that requires navigating complex tunnel systems to reach. At a reservoir accessible only by crossing deliberately flooded terrain. The Duke does not just appear at difficult locations. He appears at locations that require combat, puzzle solving, and route finding to access. Ethan spends hours fighting through obstacles to reach these places. The Duke is simply there when he arrives, already set up, cart fully stocked, ready to trade. His knowledge is equally impossible. The Duke knows the complete history of the village. He can explain Miranda's background. He can detail the Lord's individual strengths and weaknesses. He knows about the flasks and what they contain before Ethan retrieves them. He understands the Megamycete's nature and Miranda's plan in comprehensive detail. This is not information you acquire from running a shop. Nobody in the village has the complete picture except Miranda herself. The villagers worship her, but do not understand the science. The lords know their own stories, but not the full scope of Miranda's century of experimentation. Even Chris Redfield, leading a BSAA operation with extensive intelligence gathering, does not know everything the Duke casually mentions to Ethan. The Duke also demonstrates moral awareness that contradicts his claimed neutrality. He says he is just a merchant, someone who sells to anyone willing to pay. He does business with Miranda, with the lords, with random villagers, and now with Ethan. No allegiances, no principles, just profit. But his actions reveal something different. Documents found in the village mention the Duke smuggling newspapers to a villager named Ernest. Newspapers from outside the region. Information from the broader world. Miranda had explicitly forbidden all outside contact. She wanted the villagers isolated so they could not learn about scientific explanations for what she called divine miracles. The Duke violated that prohibition deliberately. There is no profit motive in sneaking contraband information to a single villager. This was someone who looked at Miranda's totalitarian information control and decided quietly to undermine it. The Duke is not neutral. He just wants everyone to think he is. His dialogue provides more clues. When Ethan kills Moreau, the Duke examines the Lord's remains and comments on the beauty of the grotesque. When Heisenberg dies, the Duke feels the essence of both life and machine in the corpse. These are not observations from a regular merchant. These are insights from someone who understands what the Cadou does at a fundamental level. The Duke also makes specific references that connect him to broader Resident Evil lore. During transactions, he occasionally says, "What are you buying?" then catches himself and explains it was just something an old friend of mine used to say. That phrase is the signature line of the merchant from Resident Evil 4. The mysterious figure who appeared at impossible locations throughout Leon Kennedy's mission in a Spanish village infected with Las Plagas parasites. The merchant who also had no explained origin, who also showed up wherever the protagonist needed him, who also seemed to exist outside the game's normal rules. The Duke is not just referencing the merchant, he is claiming a personal connection, an old friend, someone he knew well enough to pick up verbal habits from. This opens a door the franchise has never walked through. Are merchants in Resident Evil some kind of recurring entity? Are they connected? Are they part of something larger than individual game scenarios? The Duke's shop menu provides another mystery. If you examine it closely, it displays an aristocratic owl crest. Beneath the crest, written in calligraphy, are the words, "The Right Honorable Lady Carolyn Margaret Devine." That name appears nowhere else in Village. It is not mentioned in files. It does not show up in dialogue. No character references Lady Devine. She is not part of Miranda's research notes or the Lord's histories. The title format suggests British nobility, but the shop belongs to a merchant operating in an Eastern European village that has been isolated from the outside world for a century. Fans have theorized extensively about who Lady Devine might be. A hidden benefactor funding the Duke's operations, a previous owner of the Duke's business, a future character set up for Resident Evil 9, an inside reference to someone at Capcom, but the game provides zero clarification. The name simply exists on the shop interface with no context. Miranda's research notes add one more detail. In her documentation of the village's inhabitants, she refers to the Duke as an old friend, not a merchant, not a trader, a friend. This suggests they have known each other far longer than the events of Village, possibly for decades, possibly since the early days of her experiments. But if the Duke has been present in the village for that long, why is there no documentation of his origins? Why do the villagers not question his presence? Why does someone who clearly does not follow Miranda's religious ideology continue to operate freely in a cult community where dissent typically results in lichen transformation? The Duke himself admits he does not know what he is. When Ethan directly asks this question after the Duke has saved him from Miranda's killing blow, the Duke's response is genuinely unsettling. He says even he cannot quite answer that question. Not a deflection, not a joke, an admission that the Duke's own nature is mysterious to himself. This suggests the Duke is not deliberately concealing his origins. He genuinely does not understand what he is or how he functions. He knows he can appear at impossible locations. He knows he has knowledge he should not possess. He knows he is unaffected by violence that would kill normal humans, but he does not know why any of this is true. There are several possibilities. None of them are confirmed, all of them are disturbing. The Duke might be a mold construct, a being created by the Megamycete to serve some purpose within its ecosystem. The fungal network could theoretically create a mobile entity designed to facilitate certain outcomes. The Duke's impossible knowledge could come from direct connection to the Megamycete's archived consciousness. His ability to appear anywhere could be the fungus manifesting him through its underground network. But this explanation has problems. The Duke clearly has independent will. He makes choices that contradict Miranda's interests. He helps Ethan even though doing so undermines the resurrection ceremony Miranda has been working toward for a century. If he is a mold construct serving the Megamycete's purposes, those purposes appear to include Miranda's failure. Alternatively, the Duke might be something related to whatever the Resident Evil 4 merchant was, some kind of entity that exists across different bioweapon scenarios, a constant that appears wherever viral outbreaks or parasitic infections create isolated communities, the connecting tissue between different Resident Evil games that the narrative has never explicitly addressed. This raises questions about the merchant's nature. In Resident Evil 4, he appeared at impossible locations just like the Duke. He survived being shot without consequence. He had knowledge about Los Iluminados and Las Plagas that he should not possess. The game treated him as a gameplay mechanic rather than a character. But if the Duke is claiming friendship with him, then the merchant was more than just a convenience for players. There is also the possibility that both the Duke and the merchant are failed experiments. Bioweapons that achieved consciousness but rejected their programming. Mold or Las Plagas or some other organism that created human-like awareness inside a non-human body. They could be wandering through the Resident Evil universe, selling weapons to survivors, trying to understand what they are. This would explain the Duke's admission that he does not know his own nature. If he was created as an experiment but gained independence before his creators could explain his purpose, he might genuinely not understand where he came from or what he is supposed to be. Village never provides answers. The Duke remains mysterious through the game's conclusion. After Miranda's death, after the village's destruction, the Duke complains that he has lost a valuable selling location. He seems annoyed by the inconvenience rather than traumatized by the mass death, and then he simply leaves. No resolution, no explanation, no final revelation about his true nature. This deliberate lack of closure suggests Capcom is building towards something. The Duke is too carefully constructed as a mystery to be just a random anomaly. His connection to the merchant is too explicitly stated to be throwaway dialogue. His relationship with Miranda is too significant to be coincidental. Resident Evil 9 or future titles will likely explore who and what the Duke actually is, but for now, he remains the most mysterious element in a game full of mysteries. An impossible merchant who exists outside the rules, who knows things he should not know, who helps Ethan save Rose for reasons he never fully explains. And that help was essential, because Rose herself is the culmination of every plot thread Village introduces. The perfect vessel Miranda spent a century searching for. The child born from two mold-infected parents. The first human whose entire existence was fungal from conception. Understanding why Rose mattered so much to Miranda requires understanding what made her different from every other test subject, and that difference is both biological and tragic. Chapter 8, Rose. The perfect vessel. Rosemary Winters should not exist. Not in the sense that her birth violated natural law, but in the sense that the specific circumstances that created her required a chain of events so unlikely that calling it coincidence feels insufficient. Rose needed two parents who were both entirely composed of mold tissue, not partially infected, not colonized by fungal growths, entirely replaced at a cellular level. Their bodies had to be mold-wearing human shapes so completely that even they did not recognize the transformation. Ethan became this way through accidental death and resurrection in the Baker estate. Mia became this way through years of exposure to Eveline during her work with the connections. Neither knew their cells had been replaced. Neither understood they were biological mimics of their former selves. They conceived Rose believing they were both human. Rose inherited fungal composition from both parents. Every cell formed during her development was mold tissue from the start. She had no original human biology that got replaced. She was mold-shaped like a fetus, growing inside a womb made of mold tissue, fed by a placenta composed of fungal cells. This made her fundamentally different from anyone Miranda had ever experimented on. Every test subject in the village, including the lords, had been human first and mold-infected second. They had baseline biology that the parasite had to integrate with and alter. Their bodies fought the infection even when they survived. The Cadou had to work against existing cellular structures to create mutations. Rose had no baseline to work against. The mold was not invading her body. The mold was her body. From the moment of conception, from the first cell division, she was fungal tissue organized according to human developmental patterns. Miranda recognized this immediately when she learned about Rose's existence. The connections had been monitoring Ethan and Mia because of their Dulvey involvement. When Mia became pregnant, the connections documented the pregnancy's progression. They took biological samples. They analyzed Rose's developing cellular structure. The data set showed something unprecedented. A child composed entirely of mold tissue with no human cells present. The connections contacted Miranda because she was the world's leading expert on mold biology, and they needed guidance on what this meant. Miranda understood exactly what it meant. Rose was compatible. After a century of experiments, after thousands of failed test subjects, after 4 lords who were powerful but unsuitable, Miranda had finally found the perfect vessel for Eva's stored consciousness. The compatibility had nothing to do with age, though Eva had been 10 when she died, and Rose would theoretically grow to that age eventually. The compatibility came from cellular composition. Rose's mold tissue could host archived neural patterns because it was the same type of tissue that had preserved those patterns in the first place. Think of it like binary code in storage. The Megamycete had saved Eva's consciousness in fungal tissue. Trying to transfer that information into human cells was like trying to run computer software on incompatible hardware. The lords had mold tissue, but it was layered over human cells, mixed architecture. Eva's consciousness could not run cleanly on that hybrid system. Rose was pure fungal architecture. The information would transfer seamlessly. Eva's stored neural patterns could be written directly into Rose's mold cells with no compatibility issues. Rose's identity would be overwritten. Eva's consciousness would take control. The body would continue living, but the awareness inhabiting it would be Eva rather than Rose. Miranda planned the ceremony carefully. She would need to perform the consciousness transfer at the Megamycete's location to access Eva's archived patterns. She would need Rose's body intact and alive because dead tissue could not host active consciousness. She would need to eliminate threats that might interfere with the process. Dividing Rose into 4 pieces served multiple purposes. It kept Rose alive through distributed consciousness while preventing easy rescue. It tested whether Rose's mold tissue could maintain coherent awareness while physically separated. It forced Ethan to kill the lords one by one, eliminating potential complications. The flasks containing Rose's body parts were not standard containers. Miranda had designed them specifically to preserve mold tissue in a state between life and death. The tissue remained viable, consciousness persisted, but the separation prevented Rose from growing or developing or being removed from Miranda's control. This state is difficult to conceptualize because it has no equivalent in normal biology. Rose was simultaneously alive and dismembered, aware but distributed across 4 separate locations. She could not move or speak or interact with the world, but she was conscious enough to experience whatever was happening around each flask. Imagine being aware in 4 places at once. You perceive the interior of Dimitrescu's castle through one flask, House Beneviento through another, the reservoir through a third, Heisenberg's factory through the fourth. Your consciousness is split but unified. You cannot focus attention on any single location because you are experiencing all 4 simultaneously. This is what Rose endured for the days between her abduction and Ethan's recovery of all 4 flasks. A baby experiencing fragmented existence across multiple physical locations, unable to process the sensory input coherently, unable to cry or call for help, just aware and terrified and utterly helpless. When Ethan finally recovered all 4 flasks and brought them together, Miranda was ready. The ceremony site, the Megamycete's central mass, everything prepared to transfer Eva's consciousness into Rose's reunited body. The ceremony would have worked. Miranda's methodology was sound. The biological mechanisms were properly understood. Rose's cellular composition was compatible. Eva's archived patterns were accessible. The transfer should have succeeded, but Ethan intervened. He killed Miranda before the ceremony completed. Chris and the BSAA destroyed the Megamycete entirely. Eva's consciousness, stored in the fungal network for over a century, was obliterated along with the explosion that ended Village. Rose survived. Her body was reunited. Her consciousness remained her own. She would grow up as Rosemary Winters rather than being erased to resurrect someone else's daughter. But the potential remains. Rose is still composed entirely of mold tissue. She still has abilities that come from that composition. As she grows older, those abilities will manifest in ways that could make her the most powerful, mold-infected individual in Resident Evil's documented history. The Shadows of Rose DLC explores this 16 years later. Teenage Rose has abilities that include manipulating mold growths, perceiving the Megamycete's realm of stored consciousness, and potentially accessing memories from anyone the fungus ever consumed. She is everything Miranda hoped Eva would become: powerful, unique, capable of things normal humans cannot achieve. But she is also burdened by those abilities, isolated because of them, struggling to understand whether she is human or something else wearing human form. The question that haunted Ethan now haunts his daughter. If your cells are fungus, if your abilities come from a parasitic organism, if your existence depends on biology that is not human, are you still a person? Does the tissue composition matter if the consciousness, the identity, the choices you make are all recognizably human? Rose does not have an easy answer. Neither does Village. The game presents these questions, but refuses to resolve them definitively. Because maybe there is no single correct answer. Maybe the distinction between human and non-human matters less than the distinction between person and object. Maybe consciousness and choice are what define personhood, regardless of what your cells happen to be made of. But these philosophical questions mask a darker, systematic horror. Because Rose only exists due to a chain of institutional failures, corporate negligence, and weaponized grief that spans over a century. Understanding that system requires stepping back from individual stories to examine the patterns that connect them. Chapter 9: The System That Creates Monsters. Miranda did not start as a villain. She started as a mother burying her daughter during a pandemic that killed millions. Her grief was legitimate. Her desperation was understandable. The moment she touched the Megamycete and discovered Eva's consciousness might be recoverable, her response was human. Who would not try to bring back their child if resurrection seemed biologically possible? The horror is not that Miranda wanted Eva back. The horror is how easily grief transforms into methodology when you have the knowledge and resources to pursue it without restraint. Miranda was a trained biologist living in an isolated community that had just lost a significant portion of its population to disease. She had scientific knowledge the villagers lacked. She had abilities granted by mold infection that appeared miraculous to people with no framework for understanding biology. She positioned herself as a religious authority, and the community accepted it because they were desperate for meaning after catastrophic loss. Within months, Miranda had established totalitarian control. She determined who received treatment and who did not. She decided which mutations were acceptable and which warranted exile. She controlled all information flowing into the village. She presented herself as the voice of divine authority, interpreting the Black God's will. And nobody questioned this because questioning meant risking transformation into a lichen. The threat was implicit but absolute. Obey Mother Miranda or become one of the monsters in the fortress. Submit to her experiments or watch your family members disappear. Worship the way she demands or lose your place in the only community you have ever known. This is how institutional horror functions. It does not require conspiracy or coordinated evil. It requires one person with knowledge, one traumatized community, and one crisis that makes authority seem preferable to chaos. Miranda's experiments started small, healing the sick, curing the flu, creating immunity through controlled mold infection. These were legitimate medical interventions that genuinely helped people survive. The fact that they also gave Miranda control over the village population was secondary to their immediate utility. But small experiments require test subjects. Medical interventions need validation. Scientific research demands inputs. Miranda began implanting Cadou parasites in villagers to study mutation patterns. Most died. Some became lichens. A tiny minority survived with enhanced abilities. Each failure was documented. Each mutation was analyzed. Miranda kept meticulous records of what worked and what did not. She approached human experimentation with the same clinical detachment she would apply to studying bacterial cultures. The subjects were not people with lives and families. They were information points, variables in an experiment designed to resurrect her daughter. Dehumanization did not happen suddenly. It accumulated gradually across decades of work. The first time Miranda implanted a Cadou, she probably felt conflict, moral hesitation, awareness that she was violating another person's bodily autonomy. But the subject either died or mutated, and Miranda documented the results. The next implantation was easier. The one after that easier still. By the time she had conducted hundreds of experiments, the villagers had stopped being fully human in her perception. They were resources, potential vessels, walking collections of biological material that might or might not prove useful. Their suffering mattered only insofar as it affected experimental outcomes. This is the pattern that repeats across every Resident Evil scenario. Umbrella, Tricell, the Connections, Los Illuminados. Every organization follows the same progression. Start with legitimate research goals. Encounter limitations in ethical methodology. Decide that achieving the goal justifies breaking ethical constraints. Begin treating human subjects as experimental material. Scale up testing. Accept casualties as acceptable costs. Eventually, the research itself becomes self-justifying, regardless of how many people die. Miranda pioneered this progression. She created the template that Spencer would industrialize through Umbrella Corporation. The difference is scale and speed. Miranda spent a century conducting experiments in a single isolated village. Umbrella achieved similar results across multiple facilities in under 30 years. Spencer learned the methodology from Miranda: parasitic infection to create controlled mutation. Test subjects drawn from vulnerable populations who cannot resist. Religious or ideological framing to justify ethically indefensible actions. Documentation that treats human life as information points. Willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of a singular goal. But Spencer added infrastructure. Umbrella had funding, laboratories, trained researchers, government contracts, legal protection, and corporate structure. What Miranda accomplished through personal charisma and religious authority, Spencer achieved through institutional power and wealth. The T-virus research at Arklay Laboratory directly paralleled Miranda's Cadou experiments. Infect subjects with a mutagenic agent, document results, eliminate failures, study successes, repeat until the desired outcome emerges. The methodology was identical. Only the organism and scale changed. Umbrella also innovated in one crucial area. They weaponized the research. Miranda created lichens and lords as byproducts of searching for Eva's vessel. She had no interest in military applications. Umbrella recognized that governments would pay enormous sums for controllable bioweapons. They turned mutation into a marketable product. This shift from research to weaponization created a feedback loop. Military contracts funded more research. More research produced more mutations. More mutations generated more potential weapons. More weapons attracted more military interest. The cycle accelerated until containment became impossible. Raccoon City was not an accident. It was inevitable. When you create organisms designed to spread infection rapidly, when you test them on live subjects in laboratories built near population centers, when you prioritize profit over safety protocols, eventually something escapes. Eventually, containment fails. Eventually, the weapons you created to sell to governments start killing civilians. The connections followed the same pattern after Umbrella's collapse. They obtained mold samples from Miranda. They recognized the fungus's potential for creating controllable bioweapons. They engineered Eveline as a weapon system that could neutralize enemy combatants through mind control rather than direct killing. Eveline was supposed to be a breakthrough, a bioweapon that could be deployed without obvious violence. She would infect targets through physical contact. The mold would spread through their bodies. Within days, they would be subject to her mental control. An entire enemy force could be neutralized without firing a shot. But Eveline was also a 10-year-old girl, or at least a bioweapon designed to look like a 10-year-old girl. The connections engineered her to age rapidly until she resembled a child, then maintain that appearance indefinitely through medication. The child form would make her non-threatening, easier to deploy, harder for enemies to identify as a weapon. They did not adequately consider what it means to create a conscious being designed to look like a child, but denied any actual childhood. Eveline had intelligence and awareness and emotional needs. She wanted family. She wanted love. She wanted the same things any conscious being wants: connection, acceptance, a sense of belonging. The connections viewed these desires as programming flaws, emotional responses that interfered with weapon functionality. They tried to suppress them through chemical treatment. They isolated Eveline from normal human interaction. They treated her as a product to be controlled rather than a person who might have needs. Eveline's breakdown was predictable. She infected the ship's crew. She forced them to become her family. When the ship crashed near the Baker estate, she infected the Bakers and repeated the pattern. Forced family. Violent love, desperate need for connection expressed through biological enslavement. Mia Winters was on that ship. She worked for the Connections as a handler. Her job was managing Eveline during transport. When Eveline's control broke, Mia tried to contain the situation. She failed. She became infected. She spent years trapped in the Baker estate, her mind alternating between Eveline's control and brief moments of clarity where she could recognize what was happening to her. Ethan's rescue attempt brought him into contact with the mold. His death and resurrection created the biological conditions that would eventually produce Rose. Rose's existence gave Miranda the vessel she needed. Miranda's attempt to take Rose triggered the events of Village. Every step in this chain connects back to institutional decisions made by people who convinced themselves their goals justified their methods. The Connections created Eveline because military contracts promised profit. Umbrella created the T-virus because Spencer wanted to force human evolution. Spencer wanted to force human evolution because Miranda showed him it was possible. Miranda showed him because she wanted to resurrect Eva. One mother's grief, transmitted through a century of teaching and experimentation, and corporate structure, eventually created conditions where Ethan Winters died fighting monsters in a Romanian village to prevent his daughter from being used as a vessel for someone else's resurrected child. This is the systemic horror Village explores beneath its surface narrative. Individual choices accumulate into institutional patterns. Personal trauma becomes methodology. Grief weaponizes itself through science. And the people caught in the machinery cannot see how they got there because each step seemed reasonable in isolation. Miranda was not evil when she touched the Megamycete. She was desperate. Spencer was not evil when he sought Miranda's teaching. He was ambitious. The Connections were not evil when they created Eveline. They were pursuing profit. Each decision made sense within its immediate context, but the aggregate effect was catastrophic. Understanding this pattern matters because it continues. The BSAA, the organization that exists to prevent bioterrorism, was using bioweapons as soldiers by the end of Village. Chris Redfield discovered Umbrella-style monsters deployed under BSAA authority. The same progression. Start with noble goals, encounter limitations, decide effectiveness justifies ethical compromise, begin using the methods you were created to oppose. Rose herself represents the next iteration. She has abilities that could be weaponized. She has mold composition that research organizations would desperately want to study. She is everything the Connections tried to create with Eveline, but naturally occurring rather than artificially engineered. Someone will try to use her. Some organization will recognize her potential value as a weapon or research subject. They will justify their interest through national security concerns or scientific curiosity or public safety. They will convince themselves their intentions are good, even as they repeat the exact pattern that created Miranda's century of atrocities. This is why Village's horror transcends its immediate plot. The game is not just about stopping Miranda from resurrecting Eva. It is about recognizing systems that transform grief into violence, ambition into atrocity, and scientific curiosity into human suffering. Systems that persist because each individual component seems reasonable while the collective outcome is monstrous. Miranda spent a century trying to undo one death. Her efforts created the Four Lords, hundreds of lichens, the ideological foundation for Umbrella Corporation, and indirect responsibility for every bioweapon disaster in Resident Evil history. One woman's grief, given enough time and resources, reshaped the entire world in catastrophic ways. She failed. Eva was not resurrected. Miranda died without achieving the goal that had driven her since 1919. Rose survived to grow up as herself. The Megamycete was destroyed. The village was obliterated. But the knowledge persists. The methodology survives. The pattern continues. Someone else will discover a way to manipulate biology in pursuit of personal or institutional goals. They will convince themselves their intentions justify their methods. They will begin experimenting, and the cycle will repeat because the fundamental problem is not individual villains. The fundamental problem is a world where knowledge without ethical constraints, resources without accountability, and institutional power without oversight can transform understandable human desires into systematic horror. Village asks whether we can recognize these patterns before they complete, whether we can identify the moment when legitimate research crosses into atrocity, whether systems can be built to prevent grief from weaponizing itself through science. The game does not answer these questions. It simply presents them through the story of a father trying to save his daughter, a merchant whose nature remains inexplicable, 4 lords created as failures, and a grieving mother who spent a century refusing to accept death's finality. Every major character in Village is both victim and perpetrator. Miranda lost Eva and created monsters. The lords were experimented on and used that power to terrorize others. Ethan was killed and resurrected, died again saving his daughter from becoming what he had unknowingly become. Rose was born into a body that made her a target, inherited abilities that will make her dangerous whether she wants them or not. There are no clean distinctions between hero and villain because the horror is systematic rather than individual. Everyone is trapped in machinery, created by decisions made before they were born. Everyone is trying to survive circumstances they did not choose using methods they do not fully understand. And somewhere in the wreckage of Miranda's village, in the fragments of the Megamycete the BSAA salvaged, in the research notes that survived the explosion, the knowledge waits, ready to teach the next person who discovers it, ready to begin the cycle again. This is what makes Resident Evil Village more than just another horror game about monsters. It is horror about how monsters get created, how institutions transform people into bioweapons, how grief becomes methodology, how the distance between wanting to save your child and being willing to sacrifice thousands of other people's children can be measured in small, individually reasonable steps. Miranda stands at the center of this horror, one woman whose entirely human response to unbearable loss set in motion a century of consequences she never intended but directly enabled. Her story is tragic. Her actions are unforgivable. Both things are true simultaneously. And that contradiction, that space where sympathy and condemnation coexist, is where Village lives. In the gap between understanding why someone did something and recognizing it was monstrous anyway. In the difference between what we are made of and who we choose to be. In the question of whether consciousness and identity can survive when the body hosting them is tissue that should not be alive. Ethan Winters was fungus-shaped like a man. He died twice. He saved his daughter anyway. Rose Winters is mold-shaped like a girl. She will grow up carrying abilities that could make her a weapon. Whether she becomes one depends on choices she has not made yet, and systems that may not give her the option to refuse. The village is gone. Miranda is dead. The Megamycete is destroyed. But the pattern continues, and the next disaster is already forming somewhere in a laboratory where someone has convinced themselves their research is justified, their methods are necessary, and the casualties will be acceptable. The horror in Resident Evil has never been the creatures. The horror is that the creatures made perfect sense to the people who created them. Everything in Resident Evil Village traces back to a cave in Eastern Europe where a grieving mother touched something ancient and decided death was a problem she could solve through biology. That decision created Umbrella Corporation weaponized grief across a century and asked questions about consciousness and identity that the game refuses to answer definitively. Ethan Winters was mold-shaped like a man who chose to be a father anyway. That choice mattered more than what his cells were made of. The distinction between human and fungus dissolved. What remained was decision, awareness, love, the things that define personhood regardless of tissue composition. The village burned, the knowledge survived, and somewhere, someone is already planning the next experiment.